I think we are all aware that the Buddha was teaching karma and rebirth, isn't it? The Buddha would teach that when a person dies, what we call death, a consciousness, the mind, separates from the body. And unless a person has fully realized Nibbana and has no more craving, if that is not the case, for the vast majority of people, they will just latch onto a new body and a new rebirth. And where exactly they go, whether they become a human or an animal or a ghost or a deva and so on, that depends on the karma they have made, the purity or corruption in their mind and the actions they have done in the last life and the lives before. This is also what all the Kubajans and the monks following the Buddha, what they will teach. However, there may be still doubts in our mind, isn't it? Are you really sure that this is going to happen? Do you have complete certainty on that? And if we are honest, we have to admit that usually we are taking that on faith, out of confidence in the Buddha. And we trust the Buddha, and we also trust the other great teachers we may have met who are all teaching that. But even the Buddha himself did acknowledge that this is a matter where one can have doubt. It's different, for example, if we have past life memory. Some people can actually remember past lives, not just one, maybe even quite a couple. If that's the case, if we have that kind of memory, then we wouldn't have doubt. But most of us don't, isn't it? Similar, some people have the psychic power of seeing the passing away and realizing of other beings according to karma. What is called the Dibba Chakku, one of the psychic powers that come from samadhi. And again, if we have that particular psychic power, we wouldn't have any doubt. We could just see it in our own experience. But if not, we have to take it on trust, on faith, on confidence from the Buddha and the other great teachers. And that means that there is still a certain uncertainty which we have to acknowledge, and the Buddha did acknowledge that. So if your children or anyone asks you, we shouldn't immediately reject that because that doubt is kind of justified. And if we are honest, we have to admit that we don't know 100% ourselves, but that we are acting out of faith and confidence in the Buddha. However, the Buddha used quite a logical argument, which I find quite striking. And he said, no, okay, fair enough. No, this is something you don't know from your own experience, and so you may have doubt on that. So I've got two options now. Either you assume that this is probably correct. So I don't know for sure, but I assume that may well be correct. Because the Buddha is quite trustworthy, and all the Buddhist monks are teaching that, even other religions teaching it. I cannot reject the idea of karma and rebirth outright, and there's some good reason for it at least. And so I better act assuming that this is correct. So I keep the precepts and I make some good karma. And then if I die and it turns out, yes, karma and rebirth is real, then I'm on the lucky side. Now I will go to a good rebirth, and I will be living long and healthy and happily, and I get all the benefits. On the other hand, if karma and rebirth is not real, I haven't really lost anything much by living a good life, because it may be, even here and now, be more enjoyable to be a good person and not to harm anyone and to do good actions. And then if nothing is after death, there's just nothing, then there's also no real harm. On the other hand, if I choose the other option, I say I assume karma and rebirth is not real, and then I just commit maybe many unskillful actions and I do a lot of bad stuff, thinking that nothing is going to happen to me. And then unfortunately it turns out that karma and rebirth is real. I'm in big trouble, isn't it? You take a big risk. On the other hand, if it's not real, then there's just nothing, and then there's no real big difference. So the argument here is simply that one takes a really, really big risk in assuming it is not real. And if one wants to minimize the risk, it may be a smart idea to just prepare for the possibility that karma and rebirth actually is real, because then you're safe. I find this a very modern and logical advice the Buddha is giving there, which really appeals to me. And he fully acknowledges, and he doesn't dogmatically insist, no, you have to believe that. And because he acknowledges that we are taking it on faith unless we have these psychic powers. But the risk in assuming that it is not real and then acting unskillfully is just so big, it's better to be prepared for the possibility that it actually does exist. Now, however, I think that there are quite a couple of things that indicate that karma and rebirth is real. Now, the first is that it's not even only in Buddhism. There's the same teaching as Hinduism. The same teaching you can find in some African tribes, in Eskimos, in all kinds of people in different locations in the whole world. In fact, it is almost a default position unless you have got some strong doctrine, some religion which outright denies it. Now, usually you have cases popping up, and the belief is very common. So this is already an indication, and even religions like Christianity and Islam, which don't teach many rebirths, they usually all assume that it's not over when you die. Even Christianity and Islam, they assume that it continues and that there's some form of reward or retribution for our actions. So that is, to my mind, is another argument to rather be on the safe side and assume that karma does have an effect and that a rebirth does occur, and when we die it's not just nothing. Another one which I find quite convincing, and we can see that already young children can have a very individualistic character. And I think I find it very difficult to explain that. How is it possible that you have these very young children where the environment where they live didn't have such a huge influence yet, and then they have such a strongly formed, noticeable character? In fact, sometimes mothers report that this is already the case before birth, and one child is very, very quiet during pregnancy, and another child is very excited, and they notice it a lot. I mean, here one could argue it's maybe all genetic, but you can often find that even in twins, which are genetically identical, that they have clearly a different character. And to me, this is most easily explained by karma and rebirth. If we have lived many lives, and of course we come into this life with a quite strongly molded character, which will already manifest even in a little child. Another one is the huge discrepancy in talents and abilities. Why do you have one child like Mozart who can compose supreme operas in 10 or 12 years old, and other people with no musical talent but maybe really good in sports or one person really good in math. And again, I feel that Karma and Rebirth is the most convincing way of explaining that. Now, I feel sure that someone like Mozart, he would have done music before. So it's not that they just fluked it. It simply means that they have trained that ability. It's the same with spiritual abilities like meditation. Why do you have some people who can just sit down for hours, quiet, blissing out, and others, one sits down and everything hurts, one is struggling and the mind is so distracted? It depends on our past practice, how much we have developed bhavana, meditation in past lives. Another thing, I'm not sure whether you have encountered that in your life. I certainly did encounter that. Now, sometimes you meet people, even the first time, and you feel like it's someone you know. Have I had that? And you get on like a house on fire, as they say. You immediately can relate. And you meet another person, and it's totally the opposite. Or sometimes you meet someone and there's this kind of, I wouldn't say hostility, but this really awkward feeling from first second almost. And again, how do we explain that? And I think that Karma and Rebirth is by far the best explanation one can give for that. Now for sure, and if that person was your parent or your spouse in the last life, and now you meet them, you will have so much karmic connection and so many things where you can relate. And the same for countries. That is one thing I had that when I accidentally went to India at age 18 after school. I had actually applied to serve in the German armed forces. We had to do a compulsory military service anyhow in my generation. But I applied to do a little bit longer, not 15 months, but 2 years, and then you can become an officer of the reserve and you get much more money and so on. I had applied for that. I have to admit to my shame. The best thing I can say about the German armed forces is that they recognized my unsuitability. They didn't want me. And I can't blame them. Obviously it's not very suitable for sending people into war, commanding them in war. If you look at my further biography, they still took me for this compulsory 15-month conscription, but that would be then 3 months later. So I suddenly had this gap after school of 3 months where I hadn't planned anything. And at the same time, an old friend had planned an India holiday together with another friend. And then the other friend, his mother got cancer and he didn't want to go away. He wanted to stay with her. And my friend's father would insist that he wouldn't let him go to India alone at age 18. So they approached me whether I would possibly join. And the other guy, he was even willing to pay my flight ticket because he felt embarrassed that he can't stand up to his promise, not to the friend that he goes together to India. So he would have even paid my flight ticket, which wasn't necessary. I could cover that. And I had no ideas or plans. I didn't really know anything about India. And I just joined in. So I think that was already another kind of karmic arrangement. And the amazing thing is, when I arrived in India, I felt very strangely familiar. In many ways, this is 1985, it was really, really different. We arrived in Delhi, and at night, and then we had to go into town on these three-wheelers, and people sleeping on the street everywhere, and the cows everywhere. But the curious thing, although that was extremely exotic for an 18-year-old German who had never been out of Europe, No, but it felt really familiar, and I really liked it from first moment. And again, how do you explain that? And I think the Karma and Rebirth is the best one again. And although I don't have any real memories, I have a very strong feeling or intuition that I have been there before. It's somewhat similar with food. Have you ever experienced that? That the kitchen of a certain country is just not really agreeable to you? Although I'm born in Germany, there's certain typically German stuff I never really got into, like these sausages. I never really got into that. Whereas when I studied, I would like to buy some Indian or general Asian food. I would really like it. On the other hand, I don't feel any connection, say, with Latin America. I've never been there, never wanted to go there. And I think that the best explanation often for these kind of things, you go to even a city in your own country. Have you ever had that? And when you visit a certain city in a foreign country or even in your own country, and it's really strangely familiar, and you immediately feel at home a lot. I had that with Berlin when I went there the first time at age 16, I think. Felt very strangely familiar, although I'd never been there. Felt more familiar after some time than my city where I grew up, Hanover. If you have that kind of experiences, if you had that yourself, you can maybe relate to what I'm saying, and I think the Karma and Rebirth is the best way of explaining that. And when I talked about the strange circumstance, how I ended up going to India for a month right after finishing school, there's another thing which I often find intriguing. Did you ever have the feeling in your life that is set up like a script, like a playwright had written a certain script and certain things that happen with a certain almost inevitability? It looks like a pre-planned thing. Again, I'm not sure whether you can relate to that, but I think quite a few people notice that. It's a little bit like in good drama, if you have one of these tragedies from Shakespeare, and it's written very convincingly, and this person he gets into this tragic situation without necessarily doing so much right now, but now all the external circumstance kind of driving that along. And again, I think karma is the best explanation for that particular weird situation, that these actors are appearing like it's now arranged. And I had that quite a bit in my life. Another one which I find very convincing is the near-death experience, known as NDE, near-death experience. Have you ever heard of that? That has become much more common. It's actually known in all cultures throughout history, but it has become more common nowadays because of the resuscitation. It's very common nowadays when people die that they get resuscitated, at least they try. It's not very often very successful, and I think it's about 1 in 50 or something who they get back. And if someone is clinically dead, let's say the heart has stopped beating, breathing has stopped, they're clinically dead, and then they apply the electroshocks and the heart massage and the breathing and so on in the hospital, and sometimes they can get them back. And this is quite frequently nowadays, and certain proportion, a certain percentage of the people who were clinically dead and then have been resuscitated, they actually have certain experiences in the time when they are clinically dead. And in some cases that is even corroborated by evidence. Sometimes, for example, they could see that they are floating over the operating table or over the location of the accident, when they were in a bad car accident or something, and they perceive themselves as floating over it, and they see their own body, but no longer perceiving it as their own body, because they're out now of the body. And sometimes they can give accurate information what they're seeing there and what one can see only from that perspective. And in any case, they were clinically dead, and so they couldn't have seen that according to a normal explanation. And there's been quite a bit of research on that now. And many people now are reporting certain phenomena, the same again and again. The one is the floating towards the light. Have you ever read or heard of that? And many of these people who got resuscitated, they remember seeing a beautiful light. It's like a white light, but not painful to the eyes. And then they often had a sensation like they're floating towards it, or maybe like they're falling, like in a well towards the light. But usually a very positive feeling, because the light is so beautiful, more beautiful than any light you see on earth. The fascinating thing is that people report some similar things when they have their mind unifying in samadhi. They often also see a very beautiful light, and then kind of falling into that beautiful light, and that can happen also for the experience of samadhi. Another one is that they meet relatives who have passed away before them. A little bit, I talked about the simile of the airport, and when you arrive, often your loved ones are picking you up from the airport. So it seems to be similar when we arrive in the next life. Any loved ones who are in a position to do that, who have passed away earlier, they may come to receive you and pick you up, so to speak. Another one is the review. That even happens not even in near-death experience, but even if people do not die, but just have a very life-threatening situation. They often describe it that their whole life would be presented in front of them in fractions of a second. I'm not sure whether anyone of you has experienced that. Maybe in an accident where in the end nothing really happens, but you were just lucky and it was quite a serious thing. And in the moment there, in a very short moment, people can remember their whole life with everything they have done. It's quite a mystic experience, because normally memory is not so fast. You couldn't remember your whole life so quickly. But in that situation, they often can. And some people even can recognize the quality of their action and can somehow sense or feel what was the impact on their action on other beings. Often after that experience, after they're back in their body and back in this world, they often have no more fear of death. Because they know now from their own experience, when you die, so to speak, it's actually not over. Not over for the mind, it's only over for the body. So I can really recommend to get some books. I think we have something even in the library here. It's fascinating to read these reports. And I think it's one of the best indications of karma and rebirth. Now, how else do you explain that? And they're really struggling. They say maybe the brain, even if you're clinically dead, still has some hallucinations. But these are not hallucinations, and there's a very, very clear memory, and they can describe things sometimes which other people who were alive have witnessed. How can you explain that with a hallucination? Still another one is past life memories, in particular of little children. Have you ever heard of that? Because little children sometimes spontaneously remember their past life. Adesh had that, your grandson. What did he remember?
He says he was in Thailand. He was living in Thailand. So everything like the way he was talking was like different. Like the time, was it?
It's again quite unusual. Why would this young boy born in a Sri Lankan family in Australia, where would he get the idea that he was a Thai in a past life?
And in school, when they asked, where are you from? He always says, I'm from Thailand. When they asked him to draw the flag of his country, he would draw a Thai flag.
He would even know the Thai flag. Yeah, quite amazing.
Now he has forgotten.
Now he has forgotten that is very common. It seems that it's most likely to occur the younger they are. And once they go to kindy and then school, then the impressions of this life usually take over. Which makes sense, because it's not particularly helpful necessarily. Because you have to learn to live in this life.
He even asked you if he can become a monk.
Yeah, that one I remember. Want to become a monk. So this is actually not so rare. But particularly in a culture where people don't believe in rebirth, they usually have a negative response when the kids start with that. And then the kids may stop talking about it. There was a researcher called Ian Stevenson, a medical doctor in an American university, and the university was so open that they supported his research. And he spent decades researching that, and he went to many different countries. Whenever there was a case, because sometimes you have that in the newspapers, and after some years he had many contacts and he would hear about it, and he would investigate. And if you look at his reports, it's very precisely done and very convincing. He's a very diligent and convincing researcher. And sometimes he actually manages to find the previous family. And then sometimes the kids, they recognize their relatives. And it can be a little bit odd, because you have got this 4-year-old who now approaches an elderly woman and treats her as his wife. And so on. Or suddenly, some of these little kids, they then later complain and they say, "You're not my real mom," to their mother, and I have to go back to my real mom. Which shows that it makes sense that normally we forget, because you have to live in this life. There's a Sri Lankan man by now. In the 1970s, when he was very young, his father being a devout Buddhist, his father would get up very early in the morning and do puja and chanting. And the little boy was interested, and he would join his father with that. And then after the puja and some meditation, the little boy, from the earliest age, roughly when he could start speaking, he would do this spontaneous chanting. This is still available on YouTube, and I've listened to that. And it's very, very amazing, because it's not similar to any chanting I've ever heard in Sri Lanka nowadays. It's quite different in style, incredibly beautiful. And the father started recording that. He did many recordings. Unfortunately, in the 1970s in Sri Lanka, he had only quite an inferior kind of cassette recorder. So unfortunately, the quality of these earliest recordings is not that great. But even so, the chanting is so beautiful. Some of the most beautiful chanting I've ever heard, to be honest. And one can't explain how this little boy, how could he have possibly got that? Who could have taught him that? Yeah, I really like it a lot. Apparently, according to his memory, it should be at, roughly when the Buddha Ghosa's time, which is around 500 CE. So it would still be 1,000 years from the Buddha, 1,500 years from now. What really struck me is the slowness. And it was also interesting when you go on later recordings, they have a little bit better recording quality. But the later recordings, he gets faster. And I think that is the influence now that he starts adjusting to this life. I actually like the oldest recording best, which unfortunately have the worst recording quality. But he's so slow. And you can imagine why it was easier for those people to develop samadhi. Because they had this amazing quiet and peacefulness. And he goes through all the repetitions. And the Dhammacakka Sutta, he's not shortening Brahmakayika Deva, but he goes through each of the Brahmalokas with the 3 subdivisions. And he repeats, each time he repeats that etang bhagavata bharanasiyam. He repeats it for every single heaven. And nowadays people just wouldn't have that patience anymore. But there's no hurry to get through it. I think so, yeah. He ordained. He was first practicing in lay life and teaching, but later he ordained. Yeah. And I think other kids sometimes also show unusual abilities, which you can explain with the past life. So I think that there's many good indications that karma and rebirth may well be true. For me, the strongest argument is simply that the Buddha is teaching it. Now, I have very strong trust and confidence that the Buddha wouldn't mislead us there, and I have very strong trust and confidence that he has the experience, that he really knows about it. And so many, all the great Koba Ajahns, they confirm that. But I think things like past life memory of little kids, sometimes also adults. Some adults have amazing memories. There have been even television documentaries on that. And they would find in some building, which they found based on the memories of that person, and the television team goes there, and they ask permission, and then they can find things which are hidden features in that building, which even the new owners wouldn't know about it. And the person from 100 years ago, when they lived there, they could actually point out that under that timber floor, there's a kind of tiled floor with that kind of tiles, and no one would know that, not even the people living there. And when they take some boards away, they find them, this kind of thing. So I think the past life memories, the research they had on little kids remembering past lives, the research they had on near-death experience, the experiences people have when they're clinically dead, and then our own sometimes weird preferences or familiarity with certain people, certain places. These are all indications. So my recommendation would be to do some risk minimizing. And even if you don't have 100% experience yourself that it's true, not take the risk, not to take the risk of doing bad actions, just thinking, no, probably nothing after death. I think the risk is too big. And if you're a good person, if you live a better life, even here and now. So,
sometimes in near-death experiences, the patient can remember what the doctors were doing at that time. There was one incident in which the doctor who had resuscitated the patient lost his temper because he could get her revived, and he used some bad language. Later on, when the patient recovered and came back, she asked the doctor, "Why did you use such bad language on me?"
So any doctors, be careful what you say when you have a clinically dead person in front of you. But seriously, it applies not only to doctors, it applies also generally if you have anyone dying, And when they tell you, the person is unconscious, they can't hear you anyhow, always assume that they actually may hear you. And even if you talk in the next room, or even what you think can make a difference, it's good to be prepared for that. Thank you for pointing that out, Doctor.
But in my family, Bhante, there is several incidents of dead people appearing when the person is about to die. One case, the old lady who of offspring had died and she knew about it. She third one died just a few weeks before, and they didn't want to tell you because she was very fair, thinking that she wouldn't be able to accept it. But when she was dying, she said that two other offspring had come. Suddenly she said, "Now, Walter, you have come too. I didn't know that you had gone away." And that was the one who died recently, and they did not tell her that
Yeah.
she had died.
That's a fascinating story in your own family, Gamini. Now maybe to share that for the video also. Dr. Ramani mentions in his family there was an elderly lady who had lost two of her children. And because she was very sick herself and then dying herself, and in that period she lost a third child who didn't live together with her and far away. And because she was in a very frail state, the family didn't want to inform her that another child of her had died. So when she was dying, she wasn't aware. And then she had a deathbed vision. That is actually another one. Deathbed visions is another indication for rebirth and karma, and is a known phenomenon also and has been researched. And this lady had a deathbed vision where she saw her two children that had passed away already. But then she also saw the third one, called Walter. And she was very surprised. And she said, "Oh, Walter, are you also there? Are you gone already?" And she wouldn't know that he had passed away because no one had told her. Yeah. Very convincing story. So how do you explain that? It's very, very easy if you explain it with karma and rebirth. Otherwise, you're really struggling. Thanks for sharing that. And in general, the deathbed visions is another point which indicates karma and rebirth. And also the appearing of what we would call maybe a ghost or a spirit of someone who has passed away. It's not so unusual, and it happens quite a bit, that when someone has passed away, the spirit may appear to a close loved one who may not know that this person has passed away. I didn't have a spirit appearing, but I had a dream of my grandfather. I can still remember that. I was living in Berlin. Grandfather was quite sick and at home, and grandmother looking after him for quite a long time. And those days I wouldn't get up at 3 or 5 in the morning. I would often sleep as a student until noon. And around 10 in the morning, I actually had a dream of my grandfather in the little park close to where I lived. And I dreamt I was walking in that park, and I suddenly found him sitting on this bench. And I immediately approached him because I thought that he's quite sick. And then I think I wanted to help him or support him. And he just said, no need, and I'm quite fine, don't worry. And then I woke up because the phone was ringing, and my mother called to tell me that my grandfather had died. It was quite unusual. You can say it's just coincidence, but the more coincidences, the less likely it becomes that it's only coincidence. I had another weird one with an alarm clock going off. That was when my great-auntie died. I had quite a close relationship to her, and she never had children on her own, and I was always a little bit like a son to her. And there was it's a too complicated situation to explain in detail, but there was an alarm clock, and it started ringing. And later, when I investigated that, I didn't know at the time that she had died. It was approximately exactly the time when she died, as far as I could discern. It was actually almost noon in Australia, but she died in Germany. It was very early in the night. And this alarm clock started going off, and then I looked at it, and I tried to switch it off and didn't really work. And then I looked, and it was actually not put for that time. The time for the alarm to go off, and it was a completely different time. And I heard a few things like that before, and that sometimes happens. Sometimes the clock also stops working. Some clocks stopped working the moment someone died. So I think that there's many indications, plus the word of the Buddha and all the God Krupa Ajahns. So even if we acknowledge that we cannot know for sure unless we have these psychic powers, I think it's a safer bet to assume that karma and rebirth is real.